Let's talk about the absolute value of a real number. Previously, we talked about the real number line and the placement of real numbers on this line. We identified whole numbers, both their positive and negative counterparts. We identified rational numbers, which you can write as fractions, and irrational numbers, which you cannot write as fractions. And all these can be placed on the real number line. The next question to deal with is to ask ourselves how far the real numbers are away from zero. So a real number on a real number line, how far is it from zero? So we can investigate this by looking at the real number line again. For instance, the number 1. On this real number line, you can see that it is 1 away from 0, if you look at how far away it is from 0. Number 2 is 2 away from 0. The number 3.5 from 0, the distance is 3.5. But what about the number -2? How far away is -2 from 0? You can see that even though -2 is a negative number, its distance from 0 is still 2. Similarly for -1.6, its distance from 0 is 1.6. When we talk about the distance from 0 of a real number, we are talking about the absolute value of that real number. So we will define the absolute value of a real number as the distance of that number away from 0. In terms of symbols, the absolute value of x we will write as 2 vertical lines, and in between the 2 vertical lines we will place the number we are dealing with. So in this case, the symbol you have here is the absolute value of x. In terms of the example we looked at previously, the numbers on the real number line, let's describe them in terms of the absolute value from on the real line. So what is the absolute value of 1? Well, the absolute value of 1 is the distance from 1 to 0, which is 1. The absolute value of 2 is the distance from 2 to 0, which is 2. The absolute value of 3.5 is the distance from 0 to 3.5, which is 3.5. The absolute value of -2 is 2, and that's the distance from 0 to -2. The absolute value of -1.6 is 1.6, that's the distance from 0 to -1.6. What about the irrational numbers? We can define their absolute values in a similar way. The absolute value of the square root of negative square root of 2 is the square root of 2. That's the distance from -√2 to 0. The distance from pi, which is 3.142, to 0 is pi, which is 3.142. The distance from 0 to the Euler number e, which is approximately 2.72, the absolute value is 2.72, which is e. Absolute value of e is e. And one more thing there that we hadn't mentioned previously is the absolute value of 0. What is the distance on the real line from 0 to itself? I hope you can see that the distance from 0 to itself is 0 because it's that same point. It hasn't moved at all. So, did you notice something? That the absolute value of all these numbers we have been talking about have all been non-negative? Yes, that's the case because the distance of a number on the real number line, distances are not measured in negative terms. So therefore, all the real numbers, when you take their absolute value, they must be non-negative. In other words, they cannot be less than 0. When you take the absolute value of a negative number, you will get a number that is non-negative. If you take the absolute value of 0, you get 0. And if you take the absolute value of a positive number, you get a positive number. So here's a little exercise for you to try to find the absolute values of the following numbers. So, and then after you've found the absolute value, you can order the numbers and finally place them on the real number line. So what you should do now is to pause this video and attempt to answer these questions. And when you are done, you can resume the video and see what the answers are and compare with what I have done. So go ahead and pause the video now, please. So what did you do? Well, here's what I did. Here are the numbers we are supposed to find their absolute value, and if you take the absolute value of each of them, you will see that you will get non-negative value. So the absolute value of negative pi is pi, the absolute value of 1/10 is 1/10, the absolute value of 3 2/3 is 3 2/3, the absolute value of -2 is 2, the absolute value of 1.93 is 1.93. And if you order those numbers from lowest to greatest, that's from least to the greatest, the smallest one of them is 1/10, and then followed by 1.93, 2, 3.14, which is pi, and 3 2/3. And finally, on the real number line, you can locate these numbers as shown. 1/10 is very close to 0, and 1.93 very close to 2. And then you have 2 itself, and then you have 3.14, which is pi, and 3 2/3. So that concludes the lesson on the absolute value of real numbers on the real number line.